Danny Msiza never carried a bag for anyone. That's the first thing you need to understand. He wasn't a driver, wasn't security, wasn't the kind of operator who handled cash directly or signed documents under surveillance. Yet inside the African National Congress structures in Limpopo, they called him something far more revealing: the architect. Not because he designed buildings, but because he understood how to construct pathways between political authority and private profit without leaving fingerprints on either end. By 2015, Msiza held the position of ANC provincial treasurer in Limpopo, a role that granted him influence over the deployment of mayors, municipal managers, and chief financial officers across one of South Africa's poorest provinces. His political biography read like a liberation movement resume. President of the Motetema Youth Congress in the 1980s, recruited into Umkhonto we Sizwe in 1984. Years spent in exile building credentials that would later translate into institutional power. When he returned to South Africa and entered the formal structures of the ANC, he carried the kind of authority that comes from struggle-era legitimacy. But by March 2018, something had gone catastrophically wrong. VBS Mutual Bank, an institution that had operated since 1982 as a savings vehicle for rural communities, burial societies, and stokvels in Limpopo, was placed under curatorship by Finance Minister Nene. The immediate trigger was a liquidity crisis so severe the bank could no longer honor withdrawal requests from its depositors. Within months, a forensic investigation would reveal that approximately R2 billion had been systematically extracted from the institution through a network of fictitious deposits, manipulated accounting systems, and payments disguised as legitimate business transactions. The forensic report released in October 2018 identified Msiza as the political kingpin of the operation, not because he sat on the bank's board, not because his name appeared on the fraudulent ledgers, but because the investigators concluded he provided what they called the political glow necessary for the scheme to function. Municipal officials in Limpopo, despite explicit prohibitions under the Municipal Finance Management Act, had deposited R1.57 billion of public funds into VBS. According to the evidence, they did so under political pressure that traced back to Msiza's provincial network. This raises a question the courts have been trying to answer since March 2021, when Msiza was arrested in a dawn raid at his home in Polokwane. How does someone orchestrate the looting of R2 billion without directly touching the money, without holding a position inside the targeted institution, and without creating a documentary trail that definitively links him to the crime? The answer lies in understanding what a commission agent network actually does, how political influence converts into financial extraction, and why the collapse of VBS didn't just destroy a bank, but shattered the social infrastructure of an entire province. Danny Msiza's rise to provincial power followed a trajectory familiar within the ANC's post-apartheid structures. After returning from exile, he moved through municipal and regional positions before securing election as ANC provincial treasurer for Limpopo in September 2015. The position carried no direct governmental authority, no budget control, no formal oversight role in provincial administration. What it did provide was influence over the internal deployment processes of the party. In South Africa's dominant party system, the ANC's internal candidate selection mechanisms often determine who occupies executive positions in municipalities and provincial departments. The provincial treasurer, working within the party's provincial executive committee, participates in decisions about which cadres get nominated for mayoral positions, which individuals receive appointments as municipal managers, and which party loyalists move into chief financial officer roles. This creates a patronage network where political obligation flows in multiple directions. Msiza's control over these deployment processes meant that mayors and municipal managers across Limpopo understood their positions existed partly because of his support, or at minimum his non-opposition. This institutional relationship becomes critical when examining how municipal funds moved into VBS despite clear legal prohibitions. The Municipal Finance Management Act, specifically Section 13, restricts municipal investments to institutions with specific regulatory profiles. Mutual banks, which operate under lighter regulatory requirements than commercial banks, do not qualify for municipal deposits. Yet beginning in 2016, municipalities across Limpopo began depositing substantial sums into VBS, National Treasury started issuing warnings about these illegal deposits that same year. The warnings were ignored. By the time VBS collapsed in 2018, 15 municipalities had placed funds totaling R1.57 billion into the bank. The question investigators faced was straightforward. Why would multiple municipal managers and CFOs, many of them professionally qualified accountants, simultaneously violate the MFMA in the same way? The forensic investigation led by advocate Terry Motow found that the deposits followed a pattern. Municipal officials would be approached by intermediaries representing VBS who offered attractive interest rates on deposits. These intermediaries were not bank employees. They operated through private companies that received what were termed commissions for securing the deposits. The amounts were significant. One entity called Moshate Investments received R35 million in commissions over the course of the scheme. Moshate Investments was controlled by Kabelo Matsepe, a 25-year-old businessman and former ANC Youth League leader. Matsepe had no banking credentials, no financial services license, no track record in municipal finance. What he had was a documented relationship with Danny Msiza. The forensic investigators described Matsepe as Msiza's adopted protege within the political networks of Limpopo. Phone records and WhatsApp communications seized during the investigation showed regular contact between the two men during the period when municipal deposits were flowing into VBS. The operational mechanism worked through layers. Matsepe would identify municipalities with unspent grants or accumulated revenue. He would approach the municipal manager or mayor, explaining that VBS offered favorable terms. If the official hesitated, citing MFMA restrictions, pressure would be applied through political channels. The forensic report documented cases where mayors received direct benefits shortly after their municipalities deposited funds. Luxury vehicles, property investments, payments structured to look like legitimate transactions but timed suspiciously close to the VBS deposits. In one documented case, the former mayor of Thulamela Municipality, Avhashoni Chifango, allegedly received a Jeep Grand Cherokee valued at over R500,000 as a gratification for facilitating a R30 million investment. The vehicle purchase was traced through third-party bank accounts linked to entities receiving commission payments from VBS. This pattern repeated across multiple municipalities. Msiza's role in this structure was described by investigators as strategic rather than operational. He didn't negotiate with municipal officials directly. He didn't handle the commission payments. What he provided was the political context that made refusal difficult. A municipal manager who resisted pressure to deposit funds into VBS understood they were potentially defying someone who held influence over their future deployment within the ANC structures. This dynamic turned the provincial patronage network into an enforcement mechanism for the VBS scheme. The political protection extended beyond Limpopo's municipal sphere. Traditional leadership also became involved. The Venda King, Tony Mfefu Ramabolana, and his advisor Paul Makavhu were implicated in receiving R18 million from VBS. The investigators concluded these payments were made to lend institutional legitimacy to the bank within Venda communities, leveraging traditional authority to reassure depositors even as the institution was being systematically looted. By June 2018, despite the looming scandal, Msiza was re-elected as ANC provincial treasurer, defeating his challenger Siaparo Sekawati. The election took place 3 months after VBS had been placed under curatorship and just months before the forensic report would be released. His re-election demonstrated that within Limpopo's ANC structures, his political capital remained intact even as the investigation was closing in. VBS Mutual Bank had operated since 1982 as a community savings institution serving primarily Black South Africans in Limpopo and surrounding areas. Mutual banks function differently from commercial banks. They are owned by their depositors rather than shareholders, and they operate under lighter regulatory requirements from the South African Reserve Bank. This regulatory structure meant VBS could operate with less capital adequacy oversight than institutions like Standard Bank or First Rand. The bank's traditional business model relied on small depositors, burial societies, stokvels, pensioners saving modest amounts. These depositors used VBS because it was culturally familiar, physically accessible in rural areas, and marketed as the People's Bank. By 2014, however, the bank's leadership began shifting strategy. Rather than growing slowly through retail deposits, they sought high-volume, short-term municipal funds. This strategic shift was inherently unstable. Municipal deposits were large but temporary. They would be withdrawn when municipalities needed to pay for services or infrastructure projects. The bank's chairperson, Chifiwa Matodzi, controlled the majority ownership of VBS through his company Veal Investments. Matodzi was not a career banker. He was a businessman who had acquired control of the institution and then shaped it to serve purposes beyond traditional banking. Under his leadership, VBS became what forensic investigators would later describe as a private piggy bank for politically connected individuals. The operational mechanics of the looting involved three intertwined processes. First, direct rewards, large payments made to perpetrators simply as compensation for their participation. Second, commission solicitation, using middlemen like Matsepe to bribe public officials to facilitate municipal deposits. Third, system manipulation, creating fictitious deposits and concealing overdrawn accounts to hide the fact that the bank was being systematically drained. The system manipulation was handled by the bank's CFO, Philip Truder. Truder had access to the bank's IMID system, the electronic platform that records all banking transactions. Using this access, he created fictitious deposits totaling approximately R2 billion. These false entries made it appear the bank had more liquidity than actually existed. When external auditors or the SARB reviewed the bank's regulatory returns, they saw accounts that looked healthy because the underlying data had been manipulated at the system level. This accounting fraud was essential to the scheme's continuation. If the SARB had known the bank's true financial position, curatorship would have been imposed years earlier. Truder's role was to ensure that regulatory submissions showed a solvent institution, while the actual equity position was negative R372 million. He accomplished this by systematically misrepresenting the bank's loan book and deposit base in the DI returns submitted to the Prudential Authority. Supporting this concealment was Saifo Malaba, a lead audit partner at KPMG. Malaba was responsible for signing off on VBS's annual financial statements. Between 2015 and 2017, he issued unqualified audit reports stating that the bank's financial statements presented a true and fair view of its financial position. These reports were false. The forensic investigation later revealed that Malaba received millions in soft loans from VBS, loans that were never intended to be repaid and functioned as bribes for his complicity. The failure of KPMG as an external auditor represents the collapse of what banking regulators call the third line of defense. The first line is internal management, which at VBS was captured by Matodzi and his associates. The second line is internal audit and risk management, which at VBS was either non-existent or complicit. The third line is external audit, which should provide independent verification of the bank's financial statements. When Malaba signed false audit reports, the entire control framework collapsed. The extraction of funds followed multiple pathways. Large amounts moved through what were characterized as subcontracting arrangements. When VBS received deposits, portions of the money were immediately paid out to entities supposedly performing services for the bank. These entities had no capacity to perform the stated services and were controlled by individuals connected to the scheme. The money would then be redistributed to the ultimate beneficiaries, the political fixers, the bank executives, and the commission agents. One subcontractor, a company called Master Trader 232, controlled by Sidney Radzuma, received approximately R44 million. Master Trader had no prior relationship with VBS and no expertise in the banking sector. The company received the funds, kept a portion, and then subcontracted portions to other entities. One of these downstream recipients was a company called ORI Group, or OI Group, which was supposed to receive R21 million but only received R6 million. ORI Group eventually sued for the remaining amount, providing investigators with documentary evidence of the money flow. Other payments were more direct. Forensic analysis of bank records showed money moving from VBS accounts to purchase luxury goods and services for individuals connected to the scheme. A Maserati was purchased for a senior department official, with R650,000 deposited at a dealership in Pietermaritzburg. A R600,000 payment went to Tim Mukasey, the former head of the Department of Human Settlements in the Free State, for a property investment. A brand new Mercedes was purchased for R2 million. Smaller but equally telling were payments like the R250,000 sent to a travel agency to cover flights for 19 delegates heading to Cuba for a political course, and the R55,000 paid for school fees for the daughter of a judge studying in the United States. These transactions were itemized in a spreadsheet later found on computers seized during the investigation. The spreadsheet contained initials and amounts. One entry showed AM receiving R10 million. Investigators concluded AM stood for Ace Magashule, then the Secretary General of the ANC and former Premier of the Free State. The spreadsheet became a critical piece of evidence because it mapped the distribution network. Each entry represented a payment to someone who had played a role in either facilitating the scheme or providing political protection for its continuation. The document was found on computers belonging to business associates of the VBS network, suggesting it served as an accounting tool for tracking who had been paid and how much they were owed. The monetary flows were tracked through forensic accounting that involved analyzing millions of bank records, WhatsApp messages, and email communications. The investigators used cyber forensic techniques to secure the chain of evidence, including mirror imaging the data on computers and cellular telephones of all persons of interest. The search and seizure operation at VBS's head office in Mikado on April 17, 2018, yielded the servers and hard drives that proved the existence of the R2 billion theft. The investigation team, operating under powers granted by the Financial Sector Regulation Act, expanded their searches to Santon and Thohoyandou, securing evidence from multiple locations simultaneously. The scale of the forensic operation reflected the complexity of the scheme. This was not a simple embezzlement where one person transferred money into their personal account. It was a structured criminal enterprise involving dozens of participants, multiple layers of shell companies, and a systematic effort to conceal the money trail. The term commission agent might sound like standard business practice, but in the context of municipal finance, it describes something illegal. Under the Municipal Finance Management Act, paying commissions to intermediaries for securing municipal deposits is prohibited. The reason is straightforward. Such payments create conflicts of interest and incentives for corruption. Municipal officials are supposed to make investment decisions based solely on risk, return, and compliance with the law, not based on personal benefits flowing from their decisions. The VBS scheme turned this prohibition into an operating principle. The commission agents were the crucial connective tissue between the bank and the municipalities. They operated through private companies that invoiced VBS for consulting services or business development, but actually functioned as bribery conduits. The largest of these entities was Kabelo Matsepe's Moshete Investments, which received R35 million over the course of the scheme. Matsepe was 25 years old when the scheme began. His primary qualification was not financial expertise but political connectivity as a former leader. In the ANC Youth League and someone described in forensic documents as Msiza's protege, he had access to both the political networks that could pressure municipal officials and the institutional knowledge of which municipalities had available funds. His role was to identify targets, make initial contact, and facilitate the deposit process. The commission structure worked in layers. VBS would pay Moshat Investments a percentage of the deposit secured. Matsepe would then distribute portions of that commission to other intermediaries who had helped close the deal and to the municipal officials themselves through indirect channels. The payments to officials were structured to avoid direct bank transfers between VBS and the recipients. Instead, money would flow through third parties. A vehicle dealership would receive payment for a luxury car that was then delivered to the municipal manager, or a property developer would receive payment for a house that ended up in the official's name. This layering served two purposes. First, it obscured the connection between the VBS deposit and the benefit received by the municipal official, making it harder to prove a quid pro quo arrangement. Second, it created plausible deniability for everyone involved. The municipal official could claim the car was a gift from a friend. The dealership could claim it was a normal sale. VBS could claim the payment to Moshat was for legitimate consulting services. Another major commission agent was Ralium Razwanane, who operated through an entity called Gundo Wealth Solutions. Razwanane's role was similar to Matsepe's. He approached municipalities, explained the VBS opportunity, and facilitated deposits. His company received millions in commissions that were then redistributed through the network. The forensic investigation found that Razwanane had no professional credentials in municipal finance and no track record of providing investment advisory services before his involvement with VBS. The commission agents also provided what might be called political air cover. When municipal officials expressed concern about violating the MFMA, The agents would explain that the deposits were being done throughout Limpopo, implying institutional acceptance at a higher level. They would mention that other municipalities had already deposited funds without consequence. This created a bandwagon effect. As more municipalities deposited into VBS, it became easier to convince the next municipality that the practice was acceptable. The amounts paid in commissions were substantial enough to make the scheme attractive to participants, but small enough relative to the deposit amounts to maintain the bank's apparent profitability. If a municipality deposited R100 million, paying R5 million in commissions, still left R95 million in the bank's accounts, at least temporarily. The problem was that these deposits were short-term. When municipalities needed to withdraw funds for operational expenses, the money had to be available. But by then, substantial portions had already been paid out as commissions, used to purchase luxury goods or transferred to offshore accounts. This created the classic structure of a Ponzi scheme. The bank needed a constant influx of new municipal deposits to cover the withdrawals from previous depositors and to fund the ongoing commission payments. As long as new municipalities could be convinced to deposit funds, the scheme could continue. But any interruption in the flow of new deposits would trigger a liquidity crisis. The commission agents understood this dynamic. Their incentive was to secure as many deposits as possible, as quickly as possible, before the scheme collapsed. The forensic evidence showed an acceleration of activity in 2017 and early 2018, with agents approaching municipalities that had previously declined to deposit into VBS. The pressure intensified as the bank's actual financial position deteriorated. Some commission agents worked through networks that extended beyond Limpopo. There were attempts to secure deposits from municipalities in other provinces and from state-owned enterprises. The Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa was approached with a proposal for a R1 billion deposit. The deal was only stopped by the intervention of PRASA's acting group CFO, Yvonne Page, who recognized the arrangement as suspicious and refused to authorize it. The near success of the PRASA deal demonstrates how close the scheme came to scaling to a national level. If a R1 billion deposit from a state-owned enterprise had been secured, it would have temporarily solved the bank's liquidity problems and allowed the looting to continue for potentially years longer. The fact that one professional with institutional independence was able to block the deal highlights how dependent the scheme was on the absence of independent oversight. For a scheme of this scale to operate for nearly 3 years required more than just commission agents convincing municipal officials to violate the law. It required active suppression of internal dissent and the neutralization of oversight mechanisms. This is where the concept of silence money becomes relevant. The forensic investigation found that VBS executives received substantial payments characterized as rewards for their participation, but which also functioned as payments for their continued silence. These individuals occupied positions where they could have reported the fraudulent activity to the South African Reserve Bank or to law enforcement. The fact that they did not report, despite clear knowledge of the scheme, made them co-conspirators. Robert Madzanga, the former chief operating officer of VBS and a former MTN executive, was indicted on 47 counts of fraud and theft. Madzanga's professional background meant he understood banking regulations and risk management principles. His participation in the scheme and his failure to report it to regulators represented a deliberate choice to prioritize personal benefit over professional obligation. Similarly, the involvement of representatives from the Public Investment Corporation in receiving gratifications demonstrates the capture of external oversight. The PIC held an investment in VBS and had board representatives responsible for monitoring that investment. Ernest Nissan and Paul Magula, as PEC representatives, were supposed to provide governance oversight. Instead, according to the forensic findings, they received payments for remaining silent as the bank's assets were systematically extracted. The protection mechanism also extended to traditional authority structures. The R18 million paid to the Venda King and his advisors served multiple purposes. It bought silence from individuals who had moral authority in the communities where VBS operated. It also allowed the bank's leadership to claim traditional endorsement, which was culturally significant for an institution that marketed itself as serving Venda communities. When the Venda King later described his involvement as shameful, it suggested either genuine regret or an attempt at reputation management once the scheme had collapsed. The forensic investigators noted that the payments to traditional leaders occurred during the period when the bank was most actively soliciting deposits from rural communities and burial societies. The timing suggests the payments were strategic, securing endorsements at precisely the moment they would be most useful for maintaining depositor confidence. The internal suppression of dissent within the bank itself was handled through a combination of co-option and intimidation. Employees who might have questioned irregular transactions were either brought into the scheme through financial benefits or marginalized within the organizational structure. The forensic team found evidence of a culture where questioning executive decisions was discouraged and where employees understood their continued employment depended on compliance with directives from Matodzi and his inner circle. This internal culture was reinforced by the external political protection the scheme enjoyed. Employees who considered reporting irregularities to the SARB would have understood they were potentially challenging individuals with substantial political connections. The risk calculation for a mid-level bank employee included not just potential job loss, but potential retaliation through political channels. The failure of internal controls was not accidental but designed. Normal banking procedures require segregation of duties, where different individuals handle authorization, execution, and reconciliation of transactions. At VBS, these controls were deliberately bypassed. The CFO had the ability to manipulate the accounting system directly. The external auditor was compromised. The board was either complicit or ineffective. This represents what governance experts call control environment failure. No matter how well designed the specific controls are, if the overall environment encourages or tolerates circumvention, the controls become meaningless. At VBS, the control environment was actively hostile to the detection of fraud because the individuals responsible for maintaining controls were themselves beneficiaries of the fraud. The liquidity crisis that brought VBS down in March 2018 was the inevitable mathematical outcome of a Ponzi structure. The bank had been paying out money faster than it was bringing in legitimate deposits. The municipal deposits that sustained the scheme were temporary and had to be repaid. When municipalities began requesting withdrawals to fund their operational expenses, the bank could not meet the demand. The immediate trigger was the withdrawal requests from multiple municipalities simultaneously. These withdrawals were not coordinated as part of an investigation, but were simply the normal course of municipal financial management. Municipalities deposit excess funds when they have them, and withdraw those funds when they need to pay for services, salaries, and infrastructure projects. The problem for VBS was that the deposited funds had already been substantially depleted through commission payments and direct theft. By early 2018, the bank's actual capital position was negative R$372 million. The only reason this insolvency was not visible to regulators was because of the false accounting entries created by the CFO and validated by the compromised external auditor. When municipalities began demanding their money back and the bank could not honor those requests, the fiction of solvency became impossible to maintain. Finance Minister Nalanla Nene placed VBS under curatorship on March 11, 2018. A curator is appointed to take control of a failing financial institution and determine whether it can be rescued or must be liquidated. The curator's initial assessment revealed that the bank's financial statements bore no relationship to its actual financial position. The scale of the discrepancy triggered the forensic investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of the theft. The curator, Anush Ruplal, faced an immediate crisis. Thousands of depositors could not access their money. For burial societies and stockfells, this meant members could not pay funeral costs when family members died. For municipalities, it meant they could not pay service providers or employees. The social impact was immediate and severe. The forensic investigation led by Terry Motow and his team at Worksman's Attorneys was authorized under the Financial Sector Regulation Act. The investigation had powers to compel testimony, seize documents, and access banking records across multiple institutions. The search and seizure operation at VBS headquarters in Majado on April 17, 2018 yielded the digital evidence that would prove the systematic nature of the theft. The investigators used advanced cyber forensic techniques to secure and analyze millions of electronic records. They mirror-imaged hard drives and cellular phones to preserve the evidence in a forensically sound manner. This was critical because the investigation knew it would need to withstand legal challenges. Any break in the chain of custody or error in the forensic methodology could render the evidence inadmissible in court. The investigation's findings were released in a report titled The Great Bank Heist on October 5, 2018. The report ran to hundreds of pages and detailed the methods of looting, the methods of concealment, and the identities of the primary perpetrators. The report's release transformed the VBS scandal from a banking failure into a national political crisis. The report's characterization of Danny Msiza as the political kingpin of the operation was based on multiple streams of evidence: phone records showing contact between Msiza and Motsepe during critical periods, financial flows connecting commission payments to the political network, and testimony from witnesses describing Msiza's role in facilitating municipal deposits. The report stopped short of claiming Msiza directly received money from VBS, but it outlined a structure where his political influence was the essential enabling condition for the scheme. For Msiza, the report's release represented a transition from political power to criminal exposure. Within 2 months, the ANC Integrity Commission would recommend that he step aside from his position as provincial treasurer. On December 11, 2018, Msiza complied with that recommendation, entering a period of voluntary suspension while maintaining his innocence. The human cost of the VBS collapse extended far beyond the R2 billion in financial losses. For many elderly depositors in Limpopo's rural areas, the loss of their savings meant the destruction of their life plans. These were individuals who had saved modest amounts over decades, often in burial societies that pooled resources to ensure dignified funerals for members and their families. When VBS went into curatorship, these depositors could not access their funds. The burial societies could not pay out claims. Families who had been contributing monthly premiums for years discovered their coverage was worthless. The result was that elderly depositors died without the funeral arrangements they had planned for, and families were forced to accept paupers' burials or go into debt to provide basic funeral services. The South African Communist Party documented dozens of cases where VBS depositors died virtually penniless and were buried in unmarked graves or with minimal ceremony. For communities where funeral rituals carry profound cultural significance, this represented not just financial loss, but social humiliation and spiritual distress. The phrase "Stokvel Mamas" became shorthand in media coverage for these victims, elderly women who had trusted an institution marketed as serving their community. The municipal victims faced different but equally devastating consequences. When municipalities lost R1.57 billion, they lost funds that should have been used for service delivery. Vembe District Municipality alone lost over R300 million, representing approximately 1/3 of its annual revenue. The immediate impact was the suspension of infrastructure projects. Water systems that were being upgraded remained unfinished, sanitation projects were halted, electricity connections to new housing developments were delayed. The loss also triggered a cascade of secondary financial damage. Municipalities that could not pay service providers within the mandatory 30-day period began accruing penalty interest. This fruitless and wasteful expenditure accumulated on top of the initial losses. Service providers, many of them small local businesses, faced their own liquidity crises when municipal payments stopped coming. Some were forced into liquidation, leading to job losses in communities that could least afford them. The Municipal Finance Management Act imposes personal liability on municipal managers and CFOs who make unauthorized expenditures or investments. This meant that the officials who had authorized the VBS deposits faced potential criminal prosecution and civil liability for the losses. Some of these officials claimed they had acted under political pressure, but the law does not recognize political pressure as a defense for violating fiduciary duties. For the officials who had received gratifications in exchange for making the deposits, the collapse created a different problem. They had accepted luxury vehicles, property investments, and cash payments. When the scheme collapsed, those assets became evidence of corruption. Some officials attempted to return the vehicles or liquidate the properties, but by then the forensic investigation had already traced the money flows. The recovery process has been slow and partial. By February 2025, the liquidator had paid out a second dividend of 20 cents in the rand to concurrent creditors. This meant that for every R100 deposited, creditors received R20 back. The cumulative recovery rate stands at approximately 25.6%, meaning 3/4 of the deposited funds are permanently lost. For municipalities, even this partial recovery comes too late to prevent the damage to service delivery. The years between the collapse and the dividend payments were years when infrastructure projects remained unfunded, when water treatment plants operated below capacity, when electricity grid maintenance was deferred. The long-term economic cost of this deferred maintenance and lost development opportunities far exceeds the direct financial losses. The social trust damage may be even more severe. VBS marketed itself as the People's Bank, an institution rooted in the community and serving Black South Africans who had been excluded from mainstream banking during apartheid. The revelation that the bank's leadership had looted it for personal enrichment, using political connections and exploiting cultural solidarity, created a profound sense of betrayal. This betrayal was deepened by the fact that some of the scheme's architects and beneficiaries positioned themselves as champions of Black economic empowerment and radical economic transformation. The economic freedom fighters initially defended VBS when it went into curatorship, claiming the bank was being victimized by a white-controlled financial establishment. When the forensic report revealed the internal theft, this defense collapsed, but the initial rhetoric had created space for the scheme to operate. Danny Msiza's response to the forensic report and eventual criminal charges has followed what legal analysts describe as a Stalingrad defense, using every available procedural mechanism to delay the main trial. This strategy is named after the World War II battle where Soviet forces defended the city through attrition, making every building and every street a separate contested space. In legal terms, it means fighting every interlocutory application, challenging every procedural step, and forcing the prosecution to win multiple legal battles before reaching the main trial. Msiza's first legal victory came in August 2020, when the Gauteng High Court set aside the findings against him in the Motow report. The court ruled that the forensic investigators had violated the principle of audi alteram partem, the right to be heard, by not affording Msiza an opportunity to respond to allegations before the report's publication. This ruling did not exonerate Msiza or declare him innocent. It was a procedural finding that the investigation had not followed fair process. The practical effect of this ruling was significant. It allowed Msiza to argue that he had been prejudiced by unfair allegations, and it created legal basis for the ANC's National Executive Committee to allow his return to the position of provincial treasurer in July 2020. The NEC's decision was reportedly driven by Premier Stan Mathabatha and was justified on the grounds that Msiza had not been criminally charged at that time. This reinstatement lasted until March 12, 2021, when the Hawks executed a dawn raid on Msiza's home in Polokwane. The raid was the culmination of the criminal investigation that had been running parallel to the forensic inquiry. Msiza was arrested along with several co-accused and charged with racketeering, corruption, theft, fraud, and money laundering. The indictment detailed 47 separate counts. The criminal case was structured as a racketeering prosecution under the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. This framing treats the VBS looting not as a series of individual crimes, but as a continuing criminal enterprise with a clear organizational structure and division of labor. Under POCA, prosecutors can pursue both the individual participants and seek to forfeit assets connected to the criminal enterprise. Msiza's defense team has challenged multiple aspects of the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence against Msiza was insufficient to connect him directly to the theft of funds. They pointed out that his name did not appear on bank accounts that received VBS money, that he held no position within the bank, and that the evidence of his involvement was largely inferential, based on phone records and witness testimony about his political influence rather than documentary proof of financial transactions. The most significant legal victory for Msiza came in August 2024, when the High Court granted his application for a separate trial. The application argued that his defense would be prejudiced if he were tried alongside the bank's executives, whose guilt was more clearly established through documentary evidence and Matodzi's confession. The court agreed, ruling that the different evidentiary positions of the co-accused justified separate proceedings. This ruling was a substantial blow to the prosecution's strategy. The racketeering case was built on demonstrating the relationships and coordination between the political fixers, the commission agents, and the bank's executives. Separating Msiza's trial from the main case weakens the ability to present that comprehensive picture to a single court. It also creates the risk of inconsistent verdicts, where a court might convict the bank executives while a different court acquits the political figures. The National Prosecuting Authority announced its intention to appeal the separate trial ruling to the Supreme Court of Appeal. As of early 2025, that appeal has not been heard. The delay means that Msiza's trial, originally scheduled to begin in 2023, has been postponed indefinitely. Legal analysts estimate that if the separation is upheld on appeal, it could delay Msiza's trial by another 5 years. This delay serves multiple purposes for the defense. It increases the likelihood that witnesses' memories will fade, that documentary evidence might be lost or destroyed, and that public attention will move to other scandals. It also creates opportunity for the political landscape to shift in ways that might make prosecution less viable. If the ANC's internal power dynamics change, there could be renewed pressure to negotiate a political settlement rather than pursue criminal accountability. Msiza has consistently maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings. In public statements, he has characterized the prosecution as an orchestrated political ploy designed to destroy his reputation and remove him from political office. This framing positions him as a victim of factional battles within the ANC rather than as a participant in a criminal enterprise. This victimization narrative has resonance within portions of the ANC in Limpopo, where Msiza retains supporters who view him as being persecuted by rivals in the National Party leadership. When he appears in court, supporters arrive in buses to demonstrate solidarity, viewing the proceedings through a lens of political persecution rather than criminal justice. While Danny Msiza has been identified as the political kingpin in Limpopo, the VBS scheme's tentacles extended beyond provincial boundaries and implicated figures at the national level. The most prominent of these was Ace Magashule, who served as Free State Premier from 2009 to 2018 and then as ANC Secretary General from December 2017 until his suspension in 2021. The forensic spreadsheet that listed AM receiving R10 million was widely interpreted as referring to Magashule. Additional evidence came from Chifiwa Matodzi's affidavit submitted as part of his plea bargain in July 2024. Matodzi claimed he had made payments to senior ANC officials, including Magashule, though he provided limited documentary support for these claims beyond his own testimony. Magashule has denied receiving any money from VBS and has not been charged in connection with the scandal. The NPA has stated that Matodzi's allegations are being investigated, but that charges would only be filed if corroborating evidence could be secured. As of early 2025, no charges against Magashule related to VBS have been announced. The economic freedom fighters' involvement in the VBS scandal became a major political controversy when the Motow report revealed that substantial payments had been made to companies linked to EFF leadership. The party initially denied these allegations, but subsequent reporting by investigative journalism outlets including Amabhangane and Daily Maverick detailed financial flows connecting VBS to EFF-linked entities. The EFF's initial defense of VBS when it went into curatorship, claiming the bank was being targeted by racist financial regulators, took on different significance once the internal theft was exposed. Critics accused the party of running interference for the looters, either because they had been paid to do so or because they genuinely believed the anti-establishment rhetoric they were deploying. The party has never fully accounted for the allegations in the Motow report, and no EFF leaders have been charged in connection with VBS. This has led to accusations that the prosecution has been selective, focusing on ANC figures while allowing EFF-connected individuals to avoid accountability. The NPA has stated that investigations are ongoing, but no concrete developments have been announced. The involvement of figures from the Free State in the VBS scheme suggested coordination between provincial networks. The payments for school fees in the United States, the travel arrangements to Cuba, the property investments, these transactions indicated a web of obligations and reciprocal benefits extending beyond Limpopo. The question for investigators was whether this represented a coordinated national operation or simply parallel provincial schemes that happened to involve the same bank. The commission agent model deployed in Limpopo appears to have been attempted in other provinces, though with less success. Attempts to secure deposits from municipalities in the Free State and Gauteng were documented, but many of these failed because officials refused to violate the MFMA, or because provincial treasury oversight prevented the transactions. As of early 2025, the criminal prosecution of the VBS accused remains incomplete. Chifiwa Matodzi, the bank's chairperson and the person most directly responsible for the operational execution of the theft, was sentenced to 15 years in prison in July 2024 after entering a plea bargain. His cooperation with the prosecution, including the provision of affidavits implicating other participants, was considered a mitigating factor in sentencing. Philip Truder, the CFO who manipulated the accounting systems, was sentenced to 7 years in 2020 and has also become a state witness. His testimony will be crucial in the trials of the remaining accused, as he can provide insider knowledge of how the fictitious entries were created and who authorized them. The remaining VBS 14, including Danny Msiza, Kabilo Matsepe, Robert Madzonga, and Saifo Malaba, remain out on bail awaiting trial. The separation of Msiza and Matsepe's trial from the main case means there are now 2 separate prosecutions proceeding on different timelines. The main trial for the bank executives and commission agents has been repeatedly postponed due to various interlocutory applications and procedural challenges. The liquidation of VBS continues under the supervision of the curator. By February 2025, the liquidator had recovered R$617 million of the R$2 billion stolen, achieved through asset seizures, legal settlements, and the unwinding of fraudulent transactions. The recovery rate of 25.6% represents one of the more successful outcomes for a bank liquidation involving large-scale fraud, but it still means that 3/4 of the stolen funds are irrecoverable. The municipalities that lost deposits face ongoing financial constraints. Many have been required to implement austerity measures, cutting services and delaying infrastructure projects to compensate for the lost funds. The municipal officials who authorized the illegal deposits face a complex legal situation. Some have been criminally charged, others face civil liability, and many have simply lost their positions through administrative processes. For the retail depositors, particularly the burial societies and stockvels, the recovery process offers little consolation. Even if they eventually recover 25% of their deposits, the delay of 6 years has meant they could not access funds when they needed them most. Many elderly depositors have died in the intervening years, never recovering their savings. The social trust in mutual banking institutions has been severely damaged, potentially affecting the viability of similar institutions serving rural and underserved communities. The political fallout within the ANC continues. The step-aside rule, which was used to remove Msiza and later Ace Magashule from their positions, became a source of internal party conflict. The rule was implemented by the faction aligned with President Cyril Ramaphosa as a mechanism to address corruption within party ranks, but it was criticized by opponents as being selectively applied for factional advantage. Msiza's status within the ANC remains ambiguous. Although he stepped aside from his position as provincial treasurer, he retains influence within Limpopo's political networks. The question of whether he will be allowed to return to active political life depends partly on the outcome of his criminal trial, but also on the shifting balance of power within the provincial and national party structures. The broader question of accountability for political figures who facilitate state capture without directly handling stolen funds remains unresolved. The VBS case demonstrates the difficulty of prosecuting what might be called structural corruption, situations where political figures create the enabling conditions for theft without leaving direct documentary evidence of their participation. The architecture of the VBS heist was not novel. Commission agents, fictitious accounting entries, compromised auditors, political protection. These elements appear in financial fraud cases globally. What distinguished the VBS scheme was the precision with which it exploited specific vulnerabilities in South Africa's municipal finance system and the ruthless efficiency with which it converted political influence into private profit. Danny Msiza's alleged role illuminates a particular challenge in prosecuting state capture: the separation between political enablement and direct financial participation. If the prosecution's theory is correct, Msiza orchestrated the theft of R$2 billion without his name appearing on a single fraudulent transaction. He controlled the mechanism that pressured municipal officials to violate the law, but he did so through influence rather than direct instruction, through patronage networks rather than explicit commands. This creates an evidentiary problem for prosecutors. Phone records show contact but not necessarily coordination. Witness testimony describes influence but cannot always prove criminal intent. The money trail leads to commission agents and bank executives, but stops before reaching the alleged political kingpin. The legal standard for conviction requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, and influence is harder to prove than transaction records. The separate trial granted to Msiza in August 2024 reflects judicial recognition of this evidentiary distinction. The court concluded that his defense would be prejudiced by being tried alongside defendants whose guilt could be established through direct documentary evidence. This ruling, if upheld on appeal, means the question of whether political enablement constitutes criminal participation will be decided in a separate proceeding, potentially years from now. What remains undeniable is the devastation the scheme caused. R2 billion extracted from an institution serving some of South Africa's poorest communities, elderly depositors dying before recovering their savings, municipalities unable to provide basic services, trust in community banking institutions destroyed. These consequences persist regardless of what individual courts decide about individual defendants. The VBS collapse also raises questions about the effectiveness of regulatory oversight in South Africa's banking sector. The South African Reserve Bank relies on financial institutions to submit accurate returns and on external auditors to verify those returns. When both the internal management and the external auditors are compromised, the regulatory system has no reliable information on which to act. By the time red flags became visible to regulators, the bank was already insolvent and the money was gone. Whether Danny Msiza will ultimately be convicted remains unknown. The legal process could extend for another 5 to 7 years depending on appeals and procedural challenges. What is already established, through the forensic investigation and the guilty pleas of key participants, is that VBS was systematically looted through a structured criminal enterprise involving political fixers, commission agents, bank executives, and compromised professionals. The question the legal system must now answer is whether providing political protection and influence to enable such a scheme, without directly handling stolen funds, constitutes criminal participation under South African law. The answer will determine not just Msiza's fate, but the broader viability of prosecuting the political figures who create the conditions for state capture while maintaining plausible distance from the actual theft.